Hi everybody, أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. Welcome back to Psychic Militancy. I've missed doing this, and so my sort of return back, I was like, who do I want to have on this show? Adnan and I have been talking about this for quite some time. I'm so excited. I've been on his show a couple of times. We've been trying to figure this one out. Certainly we've done some tanking group therapy together, but this is the first time I have you on the social. أهلا وسهلا رفيق. And before we get started, please like, subscribe, share, but also subscribe to Adnan's show. I was just telling him before that he kind of guides the way for all of us in the Tanky universe, podcast universe, because he's always giving us content and amazing conversations. And so make sure you subscribe. This will be a collaboration on his show after we're done. But if you're on this chat, make sure you go right away and subscribe to his show. You will not be disappointed. I imagine many of you already do, but you won't be disappointed. But without further ado, Rafiq, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, Ahlan Beek, Shukran Kathir. Thank you so much for, this generous invitation to come and spend some time with you. It's always such a pleasure. And I see some familiar people in the chat, so they know that we've enjoyed some wonderful conversations, both on Tanky Therapy and on my program. But I'm just honored to be part of psychic militancy and getting back to live streams. Welcome home. I mean, although I don't know if it's really home, but it's one of your
coming back
homes,
from home.
From exactly,
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, maybe we start there. I mean, how are you doing? It's been a while since we even got to talk and communicate for reasons we won't get into right now. But how are you? How have things been? I know that you also were in West Asia. You and I both have, we were in different places, even though I saw your comment when I was doing the book event with Hassan Abu Sitta in Beirut. I saw your comment. You're like, if I were still here, I'd jump on a plane and come for that. That would have been awesome.
Absolutely, I would have. I'm doing well. I've been on several trips in West Asia and also to Kuala Lumpur for a conference, and so I feel like I've just been traveling so much. I'm getting the sense that maybe my microphone is low. I don't know how my sound is. Is it low?
I can't hear it. It sounds
Okay.
great to me, but maybe
All right.
for
Well, I hope it's okay. But yes, I was in Istanbul, and I had been thinking actually of going to Lebanon. Going to Lebanon if I had a few days at the end, but I was so exhausted from all the things that I was doing. I was like, okay, I gotta go home. I can't stay, but it would have been wonderful. Yeah. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about what's been going on and also the kinds of things that are happening. I myself was, as I said, just so incredibly busy. I didn't get a chance to reflect as much on what's been happening, the incredible number of developments that have been taking place over the past few weeks. And so this is a really good opportunity, to think together and talk together.
Yes, and we can do it in real time because same here. I mean, we were there on the ground. I think there's something so different about being in the region. I mean, I think both of us have connections there. I certainly am always, in my entire family still lives in Lebanon. So I'm always in communication with folks, comrades on the ground. But there's something so unique about actually being there. I mean, apart from like smelling the air, I'm from the mountains. So being in the mountains under the pine trees and just being there and smelling that air, there's such a uniqueness to that. And then on the other hand, also hearing and being in the region and then seeing what's happening, talking to people on the ground, talking to comrades, and then of course on my end in Beirut, hearing the drone over the city.
Oh my goodness.
24/7, right? Nonstop. It's loud and it's intrusive and it's meant to remind people of hegemony, even though every single day people are like, nah, that, everyday people are just not having it and they are resisting. And, I've said this several times on this show and on other shows that the majority of people in Lebanon are against normalization. And I am happy to report that that remains the case and that people are livid with their crony and, government and disgusted by conversations around normalization and finding ways to organize against it. There are wonderful grassroots organizations that are organizing large scale militant communal responses to this. And it was really nice to just get into the thing about Lebanon. And I don't know, region is there's so few degrees of separation between, like, you're there and then, I was attending a press conference and George Abdullah's there, or we attended Kozo Okamoto's funeral. And all the militants of that generation are there as well in the funeral procession. Like, there's not much separation between the action that's happening and getting information and what it feels like in the United States, where it feels like so big, right? Or in Canada, like there's such a bigness to it that it can feel like you're separated from everything. But in the region, it doesn't feel quite that way. I don't know if you got a sense of things on the ground as well.
Yeah, I think it's also partly that, I mean, even if, for example, you're in a populous country, Egypt or Turkey, Turkey, I think it's because the society is more engaged with political affairs and just what's happening in the world, that you don't feel so isolated from the tempo of events. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think obviously people in the region are concerned about what's happening because
Yeah.
they know that they are going to be, have been, and are being, and will be affected dramatically by the outcomes. And I think everyone has some feeling or sense of these being pretty momentous times of transition, change, potentially transformation, and change in the region. I don't see how anybody could really isolate themselves from feeling that 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 the Sykes-Picot arrangement that has been the framework for political society in West Asia, since the Mandate period, is up for grabs. And it isn't, just the radical kind of anti-colonialists, who think that. It is these Zionist imperialist colonizers who think that and are pursuing it with this greater Israel project. So I got the sense in a place like Turkey that they were very focused on and aware of these latest threats that started
Mm.
with Naftali Bennett, the former, prime minister, and maybe future, who knows, they're in their, period of rotating their, good cop, bad cops, around with the same sort of policy. But this aggressive, so that's supposedly from the more moderate wing of, the Zionist entity's political spectrum. And he's made these threats. And since then, there have been other high officials, defense policy people who have targeted Turkey as potential enemy, the next
Yeah.
enemy after Iran. Of course, some of these statements were made when they thought that Iran would be dispatched, fairly
There
quickly.
were many of those moments.
They've kept thinking that for for a
Exactly.
while. They keep getting these ideas that it's going to be over, and that they will then be able to move on to expansion and hegemony in the region, um, elsewhere. But that hasn't been the case. But nonetheless, the Turks it seems the political establishment there is starting to take that as a serious question and a threat. And I think you can see a lot of these agreements that were made, like this recent announcement of this trilateral mutual defense pact or agreement that was announced just a few days ago between Turkey, Saudi, and Pakistan, or the previous ongoing discussions that have been hosted in Turkey between, including Egypt among the four, and so forth, that a lot is up in the air. And what I would sort of bemoan is that, where is the sense of solidarity outside of strict, narrow
Yeah.
national interest, to some kind of sense of collective anti-imperialist? And you don't have to be some kind of like, raging anti-imperialist to recognize that the region is under, hegemonic threat and control, and the best solution to that is to move away from relying upon U.S. Sponsorship for security. That has been
Yes.
proven that, U.S. bases and military support is, at least as much a liability as anything else, and that
Hmm.
they are looking to and turning towards what might be the other alternatives. Um, but what I, really find astonishing is how little a sense of a wider regional cooperative and collaborative framework is emerging, even as they talk about regional security. So, why isn't Iran part of these discussions?
Hmm.
Why is this being announced now? And what's at stake with the fact that Egypt wasn't included in this? Why? Why not? These are important things that we could think about and discuss. But my broader sense was that while a lot is changing, some of the perspectives and approaches of leadership in this region is not necessarily contributing to genuine solutions. And that it's really, again, it's all about, and it will have to be,
Yeah.
popular resistance that leads the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Some people said that I talk louder than you, and that's why. And this is true, folks. I do talk very loudly. So
I
that
think it's,
might be
I don't
part of it.
know. I
I
hope
think
it's
you're
not
fine.
my. Okay,
No,
great.
I think you're fine. I think you're fine. I'm just very loud. Um, so people will, adjust your volume based on who's speaking at what time. But Adnan, I did want to say, I think you're right. And I think this is the thing is like, when you have these government speaking, whether it's Turkey or Saudi or anything like that. I mean, this is the thing is like when I was in Lebanon and interacting with people, whether it's petit fonctionnaires in government, positions, which I unfortunately had to do a lot more this trip than I would have liked, or people on the ground, is that it does not match the discourse of their people, right? These horrible governments that are vying. If you're talking about Turkey or Saudi, the reason why for me Iran's not part of the conversation is that both of these countries have always wanted to have dominance in our region, and having Iran emerge as the only one in the region that is actually putting money where their mouth is and getting popular support, the last thing Saudi or Turkey would want is Iran to be legitimized in that way, which has been, of course, a long-standing political project in the region to begin with. But right now, I think there's uh, a real reality to that they see and need to destabilize in some ways. I mean, the other thing that we heard a lot, just a sort of political analysis from journalists on the ground in Lebanon and people sort of in the know, was the function of al-Shara in Syria and
Yes.
Turkey and Saudi wanting al-Shara to attack Lebanon.
Hmm.
Al-Shara holding back, not because he's a great guy, but because he's just like, I can't open up another front. He's actually said this himself, right? I can't
Yes.
open up another front because I'm going to destabilize Syria more than it already is. Turkey also weighing in on that. I mean, there's all this sort of, like you're saying, jockeying for positioning themselves versus this larger movement that we are seeing in people saying, what do we want for our region right now? Since Iran is engaged like this, since the Hezb is engaged like this, since the Qassam brigades are engaged like this, there's an opening for a different type of reality on the ground. And what I saw across the board were that people were rising up to that challenge in terms of organizing. Now, it's never going to be at that, number one, it's never going to be at the level that we're seeing. Number two, it's never going to be covered like it is. I mean, this is the part I think we both see, is that what gets shoved down our throats as the position of these countries, as the official position, does not match what actually most of the population of these countries want, right? Like certainly in Lebanon, it was fascinating to see. I mean, there's no question about it. People hate their prime minister, they hate their president, they hate what's happening, they're disgusted with normalization. And yet the outward position, if you didn't hear any of that, if you didn't know any of that, it would match what you're saying about Turkey and Saudi and all these sort of things. It'd be like, oh, this is what's happening in the region. No, there's an entire different story about what's happening in the region. And I think keeping our eyes on that feels really important for those of us who are engaged in that sort of thinking or commit to revolutionary process and theory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the important point here is that the governments are so different from what represents the people, and that's even in places where there's some kind of democratic, institutions, regular elections, or whatever. And that's what I mean by in Turkey is like the population. Unless they've been completely propagandized or very closely connected with the elites that are tied into the whole NATO, structures and everything, people just are so upset with the genocide of Palestinians. There's generally broad sympathy with the stance of Iran, even if they get confused a little bit by all of the propaganda that suggests that they're a rival or a competitor, or the propaganda. I think the viciousness,
Yes.
really, about Syria, I was so glad that you pointed that out, because it seems to me that is the absolute litmus, is
Yeah.
that that if you don't understand that the Syrian situation is an indicator of the broader, regional set of conditions. And if you fall into some of the ridiculous and sectarian propaganda that is circulating constantly on the Arabic media, on the Turkish
Yes.
media, then you really don't understand, it seems to me, what the possibilities of this moment are. And they're designed, in fact, actually, to undermine some possibility of popular collective action, which is where the people's sympathies really do lie. And that, I guess, is just what is always so overpowering, when you visit these places, is how much you feel like you can personally breathe because of the politics, that
So true. Yeah.
you're with people who understand, right? You don't have to explain all these things. And the atmosphere, among people is so solidaristic and so anti-imperialist and anti-Western, because they recognize and understand that they have been victimized for generations by the projects to divide them, to suppress them, to underdevelop them, and so on. And yet, at the same time, these governments and are so invested in, especially in Lebanon, Syria
Yeah.
now,
Yep.
Turkey, Egypt, the Gulf, sheikdoms, is that there's sort of a political paralysis, and what the directions for actual popular solidarity and resistance are is right now unclear to me. It's clear that there's just such disenchantment with the
Hmm.
policies of the government, but what's the direction that that could take is really not clear to me outside of where the axis of resistance has demonstrated. And it's just concerning to me, you know, I mean, if there was just one state that had a popular,
Right.
revolt to join in with this, I think it would all be over. Like, like it really,
Yeah.
they're just hanging on with their fingernails because if anything goes, in this region, the sort of forces are really arrayed against the continued existence. I mean, obviously, I always go back to the Crusades. It seems to me we're close to a 1291 moment. The end of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. It happened before. We're on the cusp of that, but it's like, what's the process by which something decisive might happen that could galvanize resistance in the region more broadly than the heroic communities that have sacrificed so much
Yes.
already?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so it doesn't fall on the same people over and over again. It's so, and here's, I think, where we're contending with an entirely different terrain of surveillance, right? Of state surveillance, of surveillance of empire, of the Zionist entities. So one of the nights I was in Lebanon, I had this sort of wonderful night with my siblings, and we were in the mountains, so there's no light pollution, and we
Oh,
were
beautiful.
up, until like 5 a.m. just looking at the stars. And at some point, around I would say 3 a.m. or so, it starts to become so, again, so dark and no light pollution that I thought I was hallucinating. I like looked up and I was like, guys, that star is moving. Is this just me? And they were like, no, no, that's moving. It might be a plane, but planes move in a linear fashion. This thing was going around and then stopping in place. And then I realized, oh my God, that's a drone.
Mm,
A drone you can't hear, by the way.
hmm.
And then when you started to really focus, there were at least tens of them overhead. This is at like 3 a.m., right? So obviously taking pictures, surveilling. So anytime we're also talking about, and I think people on the ground actually recognize this, that there's an entirely different configuration of surveillance from the state and from the ways that states work together. Like, this Zionist entity is not doing all this stuff alone. It's obviously doing it in coordination with empire, with Saudi, with Turkey in many ways, and with Egypt. But these are the sorts of things that, again, when you're here, they can become abstractions. And when you're there, and I'm looking up at the sky at 3 a.m. and just taking in the level of surveillance and then the psychological impact on people, that you are being watched constantly, that there is no this sort of, I mean, we know the valence of international law and it's sky, sovereignty of skies and shit like that. That doesn't apply. We understand that. But there's something about actually seeing that and then so being on the ground and seeing, not only recognizing the heroic and the magnitude of the resistance forces to do what they are doing still. This is not a past, despite all of that. And then to see, like in Lebanon, we were able to go to a press conference for a coalition of grassroots organizing against normalization, and people coming together and saying, we need to build an actual platform. And they had a platform and they were presenting it, and the press was there, and they were making their position. And I think it was just yesterday, the 7th, they actually came together in Beirut, and there was a mass demonstration against normalization. So they're bringing together a mass popular sort of movement that can actually bring together the feelings of disgust that people have, the coming together in a coherent, platformed way, all of the troubles that people have that lead them to perhaps be complicit with empire or join or collaborate or any of it. Here are some ways that there are popular mass movements that are starting to respond to this. And of course, we don't hear any of that. In certainly in this part of the world, we don't hear any part of that. But even in Lebanon, like Lebanon is tiny. There were maybe 5 journalists there, 6 journalists covering this. And for people to know, it's because Lebanon's media is owned by a handful of oligarchs and billionaires who control all of the information on the airwaves and sound waves and everything that you want. So they're not sending their press to cover that, even in the Arabic news. That's what you're saying, is like what is being, disseminated is not that. It's not these attempts to organize people. It's not any attempt to sort of respond and say there's a mass movement here. I think the only government the only country that's really been able to get that out is Iran, with like millions of people in the street. You're seeing people responding at this level, but everywhere else, I don't think you would know that. To your question of like, when are we going to have a response that's not just these resistance or guerrilla, warfare, it's popular resistance. And I do think there are much more committed rumblings and organizing around this than we might actually get word about.
Well, that's very encouraging. I mean, I know the sentiment is there, but of course it has to congeal in some kind of organized fashion with political purpose to really start affecting, some sort of change. And I think, in fact, actually, some of these, announcements and agreements at this sort of geopolitical level between these corrupted states basically are partly to distract and to replace other imaginings of possibilities of regional integration and ways that might have, institutional expression by reinforcing this, colonial nation state models and this geopolitical discourse of national interests and rivalries, mutual defense agreements and so on, to try and push away the idea of a broader sense of, I like to think of it as ummatic, like, which doesn't mean, like the ummah, the sense of like the community of believers in the region. But that also has always been a concept that was capacious and included, many others. Even if you go all the way back, I'll just, some little history. If you go all the way back to the Pac.
That's why we have you on.
Well, you get your little history doses. So if you go to the, the Pact of Medina, that the Prophet Muhammad, when he, came to Medina, it was a multi-religious community that included Jews, there were, pagans, maybe even a few Christians, and of course this early new Muslim community, and it was early in the development. And there was a sense of an agreement for how we will have a society where we have mutual defense, mutual solidarity, that was multi-religious. Okay, like the idea of the ummah was one that was inclusive. Somewhere along the way, people's ideas of this thing have narrowed, but history shows that there were always affiliations, between, the multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic societies of West Asia with one another in some kind of, reasonable, like, of course, it's not modern, pure, democratic equality, but there were ways of living together that for hundreds and thousands of years have been part of people's social practice. They're used to dealing with people who are different in religion or different in language, because fundamentally they live together in the same society, they eat the same foods, they, even their religious differences are like, small in comparison, with like the fact that these are, kind of communities that celebrate their festivals, and people could participate in. So, what I'm saying is that there is the resources in the
Mhm.
tradition, in
Mhm.
history, in social memory that has been fragmented and fractured by colonialism, by imperialism, by the Zionist, kind of ethno nationalist supremacy introduced into the region in a particular way that we are now dealing with. But we
Mhm.
have resources that are very powerful potentially, to build upon for some kind of broader program of political cooperation and collaboration across differences that is inimical to the colonialist and imperialist agenda that has to fracture and fragment, because you can never control all these hundreds of millions of people if you don't fabricate some reason for them to think of themselves as different, as hostile to one another. You need sectarianism, you need, religious difference, you need ethno-national difference, all these things that are in fact actually really modern kind of constructs, and
Mhm.
ideologically. It's not that people didn't have differences, that they lived with them in a different way. They had different meaning. I mean, look at Iraq before the US
Yes.
invasion. People didn't really emphasize, oh, I'm Shia, you're Sunni, I'm Kurd, you're Arab, etc. There was some way in which there was a kind of space in which, everyone could contribute to the development of the society. I'm not saying, of course, like this is under the, you know, um, Saddam's dictatorship, etc. There are lots of other problems,
Sure.
but one of the problems was not that for
Sectarianism. Yeah.
all, yeah, exactly. And what happened with basically with the US occupation is that they introduced a kind of sectarianism as the basis for organizing political rights or group identities. This is how they managed it. And they created something that has had untold horrors for
Yes.
the whole region, right? So we have to really look back at our history, be more confident that actually our solidarity is with one another. And I think a lot of these kind of like geopolitical discussions about Turkey and Saudi and Pakistan and all this, what they're doing is really introducing a, well, it reminds me, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Central Treaty Organization, the so called Baghdad Pact in 1955, that the US sponsored, which was to try and group people against, regional
Yeah.
competitors for Israel, and also to contain
Yeah.
Soviet, kind of influence in the region for popular third world militant socialist, movements that were, widespread during this period, and to contain Nasser and Nasserism, right?
Yeah.
And it just reminds me that of that kind of attempt. Now, the US may not be in the front and center, partly because it's been proven a liability, or it has not, upheld the security guarantees that they've given to these comprador, regimes in the Middle East, in West Asia. So they're forming, them sort of themselves, but to reproduce the same kind of, purpose, which is to prevent, well, to maintain the status quo, to
Mhm.
prevent, the more radical possibilities that are opening up, with the horizons that Iran and the axis of resistance and Hezbollah and southern Lebanon and the heroic resistance to settler colonial genocidal violence of the Palestinians is actually opening up a horizon of possibility of
Yeah.
regional affiliation that they don't want people to really imagine and
No.
really, kind of put into some kind of genuine political purpose.
Right. And this that even these forces of resistance have always been positioned as fundamentally against each other, precisely because they're Shia and Sunnah. Right? And this is just like blowing that out of the water in terms of like what is our actual common enemy and what are we fighting against? Hezbollah and Qassam brigades have no problem coordinating. Iran has no problem supporting both Hamas and Hezbollah. And like that's the issue that you're talking. But it struck me while you were talking is that there's both a way in which we know that the forces of empire, and certainly Zionism and capitalism more broadly, have try to animate fault lines that are there or not. Like sectarianism exists. Now, of course, we can tell the story of the condition that created that, right? In the context of Lebanon, how also French colonialism sort of blows that up in a very particular way. And then it gets instantiated in a constitution where everything in the government is sectarian, right? Where the president has to be a Maronite Catholic, where there are no ways governmentally out of that sort of locked in way of thinking through sectarianism. But on a daily level, people's lived experience is not always that heightened. So we understand that there's a animation or a magnification of those fault lines that are already there. But there's something else that, as you were saying, that it's also to package a story externally. So you're importing sort of imperialism, in a particular way, colonialism, racism, but then you're also repackaging it and selling it back to the global north. Because the story of these quote unquote savages that just can't get over their tribal ways, and it's Sunnah versus Shia, and this has been going on for centuries. Like, it's always packaged that way, right? In the same way that they repackage and rehistoricize and dehistoricize and say somehow they extend how long Zionism has been there, and they say that Jews and Muslims have been fighting for a century, which is not true. It's Zionism that comes and is an external force, and not Iran is the external force. It's Zionism that's the external force and comes in and does that. There's a dehistoricization and a rehistoricization in a particular way, but it is about repackaging that. Right, because we were talking offline before we went live, and this is the part that, for me, being in Lebanon, and certainly when we attended Kozo Okamoto's funeral procession, is that it doesn't feel the same way. I'm not saying there isn't sectarianism. There's been a long-term political project to make that happen, but by and large, there is the contradiction that is sold in the global north in terms of like Marxism and leftist politics, and then Islam, particularly the Hezb, let's say, in Lebanon, is just it's not available or exists in the same way with the same, weight and hefty weight that it's given. That's what I mean about repackaging. So here we are at this funeral procession, and you had said they call him Ahmad al-Yabani. He had apparently, also converted later on in his life. And it's so moving because we're walking and there's these militants of his generation, including George Abdullah, marching in this funeral procession. And we get to a cemetery that's just dedicated to the martyrs on behalf of Palestine. And you walk in, and of course, there are all these fresh photos of young men. And then they're the older, right, graves that are grown over and all this. And you can see how long the struggle has been in Lebanon and in Beirut. And also that here's this, militant from the Japanese Red Army being buried there. There are these so-called secular, Marxists that are at the front of the procession. The Fatiha is read. There's all this is not a same sort of contradiction that is repackaged to the external world, right? And there's something about that that's actually really important for us.
I'm so glad that you came back to that, and particularly talking about this martyrology. It reminds me of my visit to Behesht-e-Zahra and in Tehran in December, and also a museum in Iran, the War Museum, really focused about the Iran-Iraq war and let's be honest, the war of the kind of Gulf Arabs sponsoring Iraq to attack Iran after the revolution. I mean, that's really what it was about, trying to, limit, constrain, maybe overturn the popular revolution that took place in Iran against the Shah. and for 8 years, right? This horrible, terrible conflict, war that led to hundreds of thousands of casualties and so on. In that, there were both at the cemetery and at this, particularly at the museum, there were memorializations of the martyrs who were Jewish, Armenian, others that I was impressed by, and it didn't seem like tokenism.
Mm.
Like in the context of this, it was really respect for the fact that there was solidarity and sacrifice, and they count among the martyrs. And you were
Mm-hmm.
telling me about the martyrs, for Palestinian martyrs, or those who fought, for
Right.
Palestine in Lebanon. And this is so important, it seems to me, is really honoring the sacrifice. That's what's more important, the resistance, than the character and the identity of the individuals, because those can come from, many different places if you are committed to collective values of justice. And the place of faith in that is important and interesting, it seems to me. It's worth reflecting on. It doesn't have to be, it's not exclusive, but we are living in a period where the vanguard of those who are fighting against empire are those who are drawing upon their spiritual resources, their faith that gives them firm commitment to sacrifice, to face the dangers and the difficult commitment,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know to have the courage to stand up. And I think this is particularly, of course, with the revolutionary Shi'i theology that is
Yeah.
leading this, at the forefront. I've been asked, actually, I just want to mention this. I've been asked, because I've been interested in this kind of question of the relationship between faith and resistance in this moment that we're in, and also how one can communicate this to our comrades and colleagues who are maybe less familiar with these
Mm-hmm.
traditions, and are raised in a very secular leftist Marxist tradition, that most people in the global South don't think about this as incompatible in the
That's right.
same way. Like there have been, of course, some very radical, anti-clerical, anti-religious, secular Marxist movements in the global South. That has existed. I'm not denying that. But I'm saying the vast majority of global Marxist and anti-imperialist thinkers haven't focused on this as the source of division. And when we, in our position here, usually in solidarity, in the imperial core, have problems with the Islamic resistance and fabricate the reason as to how can we be, in solidarity with, this religious, resist. It's again, look at those martyrs in the museums and in the cemeteries of the resistance, and the fact that this crosses boundaries, and that clearly people in that context were able to imagine and recognize and understand how they relate to resistance against imperialism, oppression on behalf of the oppressed, and for justice in a way that we could learn something from.
Right.
And so I've been asked actually to edit as a guest editor the pen, my pen is a machete, which is the journal of the
Mm-hmm.
Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. They've been guests. I think many of them have been guests on your program.
Yes.
Everyone should know and go follow and find their website. It's a wonderful collection of anti-imperialist scholars from across the disciplines, and they want to do one on Islam and anti-imperialist resistance. And I'm excited by the possibility of thinking through that. And I just want to say, maybe there are people in the audience and outside, contact me if you have something that you might contribute. What you were describing is exactly what's kind of needed to kind of think about, what does solidarity really mean, and where are the real boundaries? How are these kind of identities being used to fragment, confuse, and disrupt the necessary solidarity right at this moment? How do you
Right.
think through imperialism in such a way that you can put these in their proper proportion and actually recognize resistance? I mean, it's not about thinking exactly what you believe and what is right. It's about actually trying to change the world for the better, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so that's what I find is a real problem sometimes on aspects of the Western left outside of the global South is prioritizing certain kinds of ideological purity or being correct rather than recognizing, uh, the historical moment we're in and how to understand resistance that transcends some of the intellectual or theological limits that we've set up for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so much there that I really appreciate. I'm so glad you're doing this special issue. I can't wait to read the
Well, maybe you
contributions.
can contribute something. I'll talk with you after.
Perhaps it's an eyewitness from the ground, right?
Yeah,
About
exactly.
this procession. But this is it. So two things. Number one, people always will say, like, well, how can you support this in an Islamic resistance and all that? And like, first of all, we're in an entirely different world and that you can't catch up to that and understand that. Apart from the Islamophobia, let's put aside that Islamophobia because we know that's a
Oh, that's a
central
big
piece.
issue.
That's
Absolutely.
essential. And I'm not saying put it aside, like, let's not look at it. But like that is we can see that clearly and we can go to that. So that analytic is available to us. But beyond that, there's also this way in which, people are surprised. And this is to go back to the condition that created this. It's like, okay, well, and imperial forces killed off all our fucking, communists and Marxists and all that. So like, what would you, it's like a prescription. You can't actually side with any resistance force, despite the fact of historically imperial forces supporting dictatorships and governments that actually killed off all of our quote unquote the things that you see legibly as leftist movements have been decimated. So this is also exists in a historical sort of trend that puts us in this moment. And then you'd say, but these are the only liberation militant forces we have in the area. So the prescription to not support them because they're Muslim, what are you actually prescribing to the people on the ground? And the arrogance and the imperiousness to be able to do that as though this is the sort of dividing line that you're saying is going to make something actually liberatory or not. Well, like you were saying, who has actually sacrificed here? And who has positioned themselves and given of themselves? And they themselves tell us it is in alignment with their faith. Who am I? Like that for me on just that level, right? On another level, when we were there, when they were giving sort of speeches as they buried Kozo and they were giving speeches, number one, I didn't know that he was the first person to be given asylum in Lebanon. I had no idea. But for folks who might not know also, he was living and sort of transported under the protection of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which we know their position, their sort of leftist position, non-Muslim, secular, and he was sort of transported between the camps. But one of the things that was said during this speech, and this is why I'm saying because it was said publicly and covered in the press too, is that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah put out a call for his own health professionals to take care of Kozo and entrust his health with them. And that's what it's like, that's the sort of thing we're talking about, that Sayyid Nasrallah himself, which has a lot of beef with the PFLP in terms of like ideologically speaking, but understands as a resistance force who their coalition is. And that is where it all kind of comes undone, this sort of global north idea of like, this is the thing that will make us stop working in coalition as a resistance force and movement that is committed to anti-imperial destroying imperialism in our region. That's what I always come down to. Like, if Nasrallah can, like, how is it that we're still having these fights? And maybe that's where it goes back to fundamentally Islamophobic,
Yeah. I think there's something to that, but I think that's a wonderful example. I mean, it really illustrates the way in which actual practice of resistance is what produces the political insight and conceptual understanding, right? People think that you go, oh, let's study the theory and then we look into the practice. Actually, it emerges the other way. That is a position that he can arrive to because he has been immersed in the practice of resistance, right? So that's where you get that kind of political refinement and astuteness to see through all the other BS and focus on what is meaningful for the actual liberation struggle. And I think it doesn't come when you start just with the theory and then you have to choose the right theory. You have to be a Marxist anti-imperialist or, and not an Islamist, etc. When you actually are engaged in real resistance practice, you come to a different position of understanding how these things fit together, what are the priorities, what's important to emphasize. And so I think that's kind of a really interesting and good example of what we're thinking about. And of course, we should probably mention that, we were just right after Arabaeen, okay,
Yes.
and so this is a kind of
You
important.
anticipated where I was gonna go.
Well, that's the logical next thing to mention is
Yes.
really thinking about how this revolutionary Shi'i theology use of sacred history has become an immense resource for popular resistance to empire and on behalf of justice. I mean, we just witnessed earlier this last week the largest annual gathering of people in the world, in the history of the world, as an annual commemoration of the 40th day, Arabaeen meaning the 40th day since the Ashura, which is the 10th day of Muharram, and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of Muhammad, and the third Imam in Shi'i tradition. That is the third of the spiritual guides and leaders in Shi'i tradition, whose martyrdom at Karbala on Ashura represents increasingly not just mourning, that the sadness and grief. And you, of course, know the Azza, is 40th day is very important in the
Yes.
traditions of mourning and grieving, is after the death, the 40th day and then the year anniversary. These are kind of the important moments where you come back to commemorate, remember, pray, celebrate the achievements and offer condolences to the family.
Wear black throughout it, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this 40th day is redolent with that kind of sense of we are, in this period of mourning for 40 days, and the 40th day is a culmination of a period of mourning and grieving. But what's happened since, changes in the 20th century, particularly the Iranian Revolution and other thinkers in southern Lebanon and people like Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, is that they have transformed these rituals and experiences of devotional grieving and mourning that had this kind of spiritual and emotional, dimension that distinguished Shi'i devotional piety and remembrance for the injustices that happen. It has turned into something that is also revolutionary motivation of the example of standing up against oppression. And so you had 20 million people going to attend this in Karbala, many people walking, many millions walking. And not even, if you can't go to Karbala, people did walks in other places. They had a huge march in Dearborn, Michigan, where 45 to 50,000 people walked from the Karbala center, okay, to another point in order to process, to demonstrate. And you can see how these religious rituals of procession, of pilgrimage and
Yes.
procession actually are also galvanizing for protest. I mean, it's just the
Yeah.
same techniques, right? Except that the meaning has transformed from simple grief and, self-blame, mortifying, why didn't we, defend you, Imam Hussein, to we can do something about this. Because everybody who stands up for justice is and willing to sacrifice themselves, like Imam Hussein, is somebody that we should support. We should emulate his, noble example of being willing to sacrifice on behalf of truth, justice, and against oppressive and tyrannical rule. So having the, millions of people marching just over the last few days, inculcating this kind of idea and reminding themselves since Ashura is actually a very powerful thing. And I think it's such an incredible contrast. If you think about how, firstly, many people came from 50 different countries, and of course, millions from Iran into Iraq. It makes a mockery of the colonial boundaries of the nation state, right?
Yeah.
This is a truly transnational, ummatic kind of experience that, and how it's administered. Can you imagine a society like Iraq that has suffered, so, since 1990s? Right. Well, firstly, of course, it was part of this terrible war on Iran. But then in the Gulf War, the U.S. invasion, sanctions, horrible sanctions, then the U.S. invasion and occupation. We just
Right.
had the 20th anniversary not that long ago of that, just a couple of years ago. And how devastated this society has been by war, by sanctions, and all that. They hosted 20 million people without problems. How is that possible? It's
Right.
possible because of this incredible social solidarity and the institutions that they've developed of care, of solidarity. There are all these mawakib, these stations for grief and mourning, but stations for providing services, free food, free drinks, places to stay, blankets if you need to, on this 3-day walk that many people do from Najaf, which is where the tomb of Imam Hussein's father, Imam Ali, radiallahu anh, is buried. His tomb is in Najaf, and that's about 80 kilometers from Karbala. And many people take the journey. They go to Najaf and then they walk, and it's a 3-day walk, and they stay overnight in places along the way. There were thousands of stations to provide care and support for the worshipers, the pilgrims, the people processing. This is incredible. And I
Yeah.
contrast it with the Hajj, the Saudi administered Hajj, where it's like a fraction of the number of people. They make you do all these visa requirements. They've turned it into luxury religious tourism with 5-star hotels, and they're managing it as part of their, economy to, make money out of this. And look at the incredible contrast, the humility of walking. You cannot change this ritual
Yeah.
into religious tourism because it's based on the humble act of walking as a pious pilgrim, not flying in and staying in these big hotels and spending thousands upon thousands of dollars for something that's supposed to be a spiritual experience. It's been commodified
Yeah.
under, this other kind of model. It's really incredible to see the contrast in these kind of values. This is the source for what is called the Karbala paradigm that, Sayyid Akbar Haidar called about this new interpretation and understanding of solidarity, of social justice, of social support that has become hardwired into contemporary some forms. I'm not saying every Shi'i thinks this.
Right.
There are different scholars, and of course, the mourning and the grief component is and the ritualistic element is very important for so many millions of people. But there is also this element that constantly is pushing you to think about others and to identify with the cause of justice. I mean, that
Right.
to me is like such an incredible resource, that the
Mm-hmm.
people of this region have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think what you're saying is how fundamental the act of remembering is, which is through the ritualistic process of enacting, of your embodying that walk back. It's a reconstitution and remembering. And of course, I'm not the first person to sort of like remembering as in memory, but also remembering as in coming together, right? The disconnection or the alienation or the atomization, to remember, to bring back members together into a larger collective. And that the remembering also of the power of people doing some things that seem so simple. I'm just thinking about 50,000 people in Dearborn, Michigan, and also seeing how that destabilizes something at a larger level, destabilizes the state. I was seeing stuff of, on Instagram, like people were freaking the fuck out, right? Because anytime you have Imam Hussein flag or anything that's like black and red and sort of, 50,000 Muslims and Shia Muslims marching in the street, it activates every possible base fear that is inculcated into people about what that means. On the flip side of that, what if we were to seize the flip side of that and say that there's something fundamentally disruptive to the hegemonic Eurocentric position and centrality that tells us that things can only be this way? And what you're saying is, look at this mass coming together of people under this banner for this reason, and for this simple reason of reconstituting, remembering, recommitting, realigning with justice. That feels so powerful to me, because I think a lot of people always are also searching for what is something big we can do. And I'm not saying this isn't big. Millions of people doing this is big. But let's say on an individual level, in its collective sense, it's big. But on an individual level, committing and saying, this is something that I'm going to do. Here's the source of that. Here's the condition I'm connecting back to. Here's what it means in the larger sense of things. Here's how it is not disconnected, not disavowing the spiritual or religious reasons why I do this, but also recognizing how it transports or is operationalized in this current moment, right? Because people in those processions are also like, what are they? Of course, they're considering the historical moment that they're sort of coming back to, but also I imagine reflecting on the current moment. What is our responsibilities right now?
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, what has galvanized this devotional orientation of the Karbala
Right.
moment, is how it relates to the contemporary. You see that, like, I talked a little bit about this, with some guests, and reflecting on Ali Shariati's Red Shiism and Black Shiism, an important, essay as part of his one of his important books, is how it relates to the contemporary circumstances and the obvious analogies people make between, for example, the suffering of the family of the members. It wasn't just Imam Hussein, but 70 members of his, entourage,
Ahl
family, close
al-Bayt, yeah.
associates, the people of the house,
Mm-hmm.
who, were most of whom died with him, several of which were taken as prisoners, and who suffered through, where they were prevented from drinking from the nearby water source and river. And people reflecting, this is like what's happening to the people of Gaza right now,
Yeah.
how they were suffering hunger and thirst. People made the obvious, kind of connection that
Yeah.
they are witnessing this today. I mean, it's such a powerful an analogy. I mean, during the revolution, Imam Khomeini drew, the parallels between the people, himself and the others, and the way he was situated with the people, versus the Shah as the Yazid, the tyrant who is oppressing the people. Like this historical commemoration
Mm.
operates between periods of time. It's not like history from in the past. It's making it through the ritual, through the commemoration, through the performance, through thinking and reflecting about it, is making it relevant as a way of thinking about oppression and justice in our own time. And that's why it is such a powerful ritual. And that's why so many millions. I mean, I think, there would be many pious and devout people who would go just for the mourning and the grief.
Right.
But I think there are many more. And the intensity of the emotions is because it operates in multiple levels and has been made relevant to the contemporary conditions where people are not remembering and observing, they are now participating in some meaningful way in that titanic struggle against oppression and tyranny on behalf of justice. That's how people are made to
Yeah.
feel. Now, if this could be turned, okay, and this is what everyone would be worried about in the
Yes.
status quo, all of these, kind of corrupt, governments and rulers and the capitalist imperialists and what they are worried about is that sense of feeling and solidarity and emotion becoming an organized political force. And
Yeah,
that's, of course, why
galvanizing that.
Iran. Yeah, that's why
Yep.
Iran has been targeted, is because they did manage to do that, and they had
Hmm.
a revolution and reoriented the direction of their society and their politics. And for whatever limitations you want to say, they have been, suffering and dealing, and no government is perfect in its portrayal, in its representation of its people on behalf of their interests. But they were doing it for their people's interests. They were not doing it, whatever they did, whether you agree, disagree, they did it for that society. They weren't doing it on behalf of, the Zionists or the imperialists, who had put them in place. They were sovereign. And so whatever, you know, decisions they make are ones that are on behalf of their society. And for that, they have been made to
Yeah.
pay and
Yes.
suffer and have to sacrifice. And that is something, that
Yeah.
is just history. You just have to understand is that if there were more societies in West Asia that were actually reflective and were governed, on behalf of their people, this whole situation would be different. Would be different. Um, and so we have to kind of keep. I think we need to pay attention to these moments so that we
Yeah.
can think, how do we, uh, foster and circulate and disseminate and make more real in the world the evident feelings of solidarity, feelings of justice, political realities. Like that's what
Yeah.
we have to be doing.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think actually the hubris of empire and Zionism has contributed to what you're saying, right? Because this recent incursion and aggression against Iran, I think has actually solidified, I mean, we've seen it, it's not just me thinking it, is that has solidified people's commitment to certainly within Iran to Iran as a nation state, but then also to Shia sort of commitments to justice, seeing this, it's actually backfired. Just like releasing that video of Sinwar
Mm,
backfired
yeah,
miserably.
yeah.
This sort of aggression is doing that. One of the things that I kept hearing in Lebanon over and over and over again is how so many people are reinterested in Shia, right? Sort of looking into it, sort of studying what Shia commitments are to justice, about if they're thinking about converting to Islam, it's to become Shia, right? Students all want to become Shia. Like we met some students who were part of the student intifada and telling us about like their comrades, they're all of them sort of converting, and that it would be to become Shia, but to become Shia because that is what they're seeing to your point, that's what they're seeing in the world. This is not just, they're seeing and they're understanding the commitments to the world through this sort of worldview and religious practice. And for me, I mean, I just delight. I'm just listening and I'm like, this is fantastic. We certainly have a different world upon us.
Well, it's so interesting. And, I mean, I've seen also a lot of defensiveness among certain parts of the intelligentsia or the Sunni supported, we know that the media
Yeah.
throughout the region and even beyond the region is really in the hands of these Gulf monarchies. The oil money is going into basically disseminating imperialist and sectarian propaganda around, the world, and it of course has its ramifications in, Sunni discussions and media online and elsewhere, that there are groups that are being pushed to promote sectarianism, but they are on so much the defensive
Yes.
because it isn't about like, oh, do you believe in the hidden imam or not? It's about, do you stand for justice? And if this is the group that is representing that kind of ummatic solidarity, that commitment to justice, it's attractive. It's attractive to everyone because they
Yeah.
see these beautiful values of willingness to sacrifice for a better world. I mean, this is so compelling. And so it's putting on the defensive these groups that, want to manufacture sectarianism. It's not about like these particular, individual propositions of belief. It's about the fact that there's a whole commitment to a better world. That's what's attracting, Sunni young people,
Right.
Sunni people
Yes.
everywhere, all these others who are saying, we want a better world. We want a different world. If this is a mechanism for advancing that and uniting, I think what's important about this relation, I don't think it's just instrumental at all. Obviously, I do a
Yeah.
whole series on the names of God as a
Yeah.
spiritual practice that I try and connect with how it might help us also be committed to justice in the world. I don't see, spiritual orientation as something that should take you away from engagement, with the world. I think that's a false division that has been imposed in modernity, and by using a certain kind of Protestant Christian idea about the difference of what religion is as opposed to the secular that constructs the religion as separate, and uses a kind of Christian Protestantism as the norm for the spiritual, and kind of universalizes or globalizes that, and then convinces people that they should see a difference between, but which is obviously not operative when we're talking about these resistance movements, is that they find some spiritual connection that impels and helps them commit to the cause of
Hmm.
justice. So there's an intimate relationship between, those things. So I'm not saying that it's instrumental at all.
Right.
I'm saying that there is an intimate connection between the two. But what's more important for people is to harness their kind of emotional and spiritual life to the cause of fighting for justice, fighting against oppression, and fighting for a better world. And if this is a technique, a mechanism, a culture,
Yeah.
that is inculcating the values of resistance to really be a human being in this world. I mean, that's what it is communicating, and that's what it's drawing upon, is that there's a clear need. And I think actually, I feel like the secular left, I feel sorry for the secular left sometimes, because it seems that they have not developed the techniques which you could, I believe you could, find a way to harness this sustaining, kind of inner resource. Like we're always thinking when we talk about, kind of material conditions is yes, but people are the ones who have to do the change together. So we have to find the resources inside of us, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, to commit to that, to support one another, to have that sense of solidarity, and the fact that this is a long struggle, like, my whole
Yes.
life, and this is like the most exciting period in my whole life politically. But how do you get to this point? If you
Yeah.
are older, you have to have something that allows you to keep up the struggle, keep up the commitment, to
Yes.
fight off the despair. And you do so much wonderful work with psychic militancy that is a part of it. That's why I see what you're doing as very compatible with what I've been interested in some ways. And I actually gave a couple of talks about, um, you know, exactly this sort of question, particularly designed for the Sunnis who, like, look, you should be in solidarity with revolutionary Shi'i theology. But if you can't get your head around some of the doctrines, look to your own tradition. In fact, actually, who led anti colonial resistance in Islamic societies against the French, against the British, against the Dutch,
Mm-hmm.
against the Russians in the Caucasus? Everywhere it was led by the Sufis,
Mm-hmm.
are the people who are dedicated to spiritual life. Did that mean, oh, we withdraw from the world and we have nothing to do with it because the spiritual and the political don't go together? No. In fact, actually, they thought the spiritual training was what enabled you to actually care and commit to radical sacrifice in the world to combat injustice, occupation, and so forth. So why not go back to those traditions? I mean, we've tried to kind of forget in this Wahhabist Salafist orientation. They're radically anti-Sufi. They've been convinced by the Western modernity paradigm that, oh, that was superstitious stuff that was holding us back. The Islamic
Mm-hmm.
modernists thought, oh, this spiritual stuff is just superstition and is holding us back, when in fact, actually, what they gave up was one of the greatest resources that they had available to
Totally.
them,
Mm-hmm.
to continue to struggle against colonialism. Um,
Yeah.
so
And,
yeah, anyway, there was a rant, but
no, I love it. I love it. I mean, it's not a Cena rant, but it's Adnan. No, I love the Adnan version of that. No, because I think what you're saying is there's something so powerful about also locating it within the current moment. And for me, what you said, I feel sorry for the secular left sometimes. I'm sort of going back to that, is like, you're so right, because they're often searching for what is it that sustains militancy and struggle and the ability to do that. And somehow it's like, this is you're missing the entire piece, even when people tell you that directly. And on the other hand, it's like, I don't hear our militants saying they're burnt out at the end of the
yeah,
day,
that's
which
right.
is
That's the
like,
problem.
there's something about being sustained by a larger, just like our causes to liberation are what sustains us. But imagine that cause to liberation also coursing through your existence as part of a larger spiritual practice that orients you to the entire world and that provides a sense of calm and alignment that tells you there's something bigger here. There's something bigger here, and it might not be in our lifetime either. There's some, and that, I think, that is part of the reason, definitely in Palestine and in Lebanon, like, that's something Zionism can't wrap its hands around either, and it's not there for capture. That's the thing I think I also look at when I feel bad for the secular. If it's like all these things you're missing that are actually fall outside the purview of state enclosures, right? The state is not going to, I mean, that's the fucking history of this.
Yeah.
It's like the state is not going to dictate people's commitment to their religious revolutionary practices. And it also betrays something very specific. For me, I'm always, when I think about psychic militancy, it's to always be suspicious about these positions that people just can't shake off, even when somebody is telling you right in front of you what it is that actually fuels them and fuels their struggle. You're still searching for something else to kind of wonder and say, I wonder if there's something ideological here at play. Perhaps white supremacy, perhaps racism, perhaps, a fundamental superiority that comes with your position in the global north when you're thinking through these things, or the need for something to be legible for you, for it to become important. And I think that all of those things feel really important for us to remind people about.
Definitely. I mean, I agree with you completely that it's sort of the hostility towards this
Yeah.
exposes other kinds of problems and commitments. So it's good that we
Yes.
talk about these things, but we have to do that honestly, because to be honest, there's such arrogance. And this is also what is
Mm.
disturbing and troubling, is that the same kind of arrogance that leads to Orientalist, kind of racist invasion of Iran, and they think that it's going to be, a cakewalk,
Yep.
because, of course, how could these, brown, people under their mullahs actually understand, tactics and technology and whatnot, right? So, like that kind of hubris and imperial hubris and arrogance, what the Iranians have called istikbar, right?
Yep.
Which is what they really target about the West, about U.S. Empire and hegemony, is istikbar, this sort of sense of arrogance,
Mhm.
that that's similar to this Islamophobic. These people, if they're, they believe in God, they must be incapable of, like, actually struggling for a better world on behalf of us all, right? Like it's just a principle that is unexamined and is not tested in the light of history. That's, to me, the real problem with it, is that it really is ideological. Because if you look, and that's what I try and do in my work, is talk about the long history of Islam and anti-imperialist resistance, whether it's these Sufi orders, or whether it's the crusade, counter crusade, and the way in which a discourse was revived. Jihad
Mhm.
is a dirty word for so many people, but there was the jihad against the Crusaders, and it's that resistance in that era that I think, actually, in fact, you can't really understand modern world history without recognizing and understanding that the West was prevented from controlling West Asia in the medieval period. And since then, after that attempt, they've been trying for hundreds of years, but they were kept from doing so. The Ottoman Empire, fought them. In fact, it actually even put them on the defensive for periods in the Balkans. And it's because of that the West went into the Atlantic world to begin with. And they exported their settler colonialism, enslavement, sugar plantations, which they all tried in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. They tried to have sugar plantations in Lebanon, where you were. I've seen and visited sites where the Crusaders, during the era of the County of Tripoli in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, they tried to, create this plantation economy for sugar production, raising, growing sugar and processing sugar with enslaved labor. Okay. All of the elements that we think of as the Atlantic system of what they created, in the Western Hemisphere, that enabled them, to make this kind of leap in military and economic power. They were prevented from doing at that time. They went into the Atlantic world. They managed to do it there, and then they used those resources to try and colonize and control the rest of the world in the 18th and 19th and into the early 20th centuries, before resistance again was
Mhm.
successful. And that the whole history of Western capitalism is actually also of colonialism and settler colonialism,
Yes.
and of resistance to it. And
Right.
this, we're just part of this great chain, of resistance. And
Right.
so what you were saying about that kind of being dispirited, or maybe even, kind of getting burnt out and thinking, oh, we're not going to see the end of this, in our lifetimes. Well, that's the whole point, is we are part of many ancestors who have sacrificed, who have fought, who didn't see the liberation. We may be the lucky ones to see it, but
Yeah.
our job is to contribute to that. That's what it means to be part of, history, and have some greater purpose, right?
Yep.
Is we're living for the liberation of the world, the fulfillment of the human, which has never really been seen in the history of the world, because the Western kind of idea of the human was never universalized. They always, like, had a distinction of the colonized as not really human. And now, when we're fighting for human dignity, as the great people of Palestine have been doing for 80 years, but especially so powerfully in this last 3 years against this accelerated and intensified genocide, they have been teaching us what
Yeah.
human dignity is. And at the very moment that it's now becoming a global, thing, that people are attracted to that struggle, and
Right.
recognizing that,
the West stands for genocide. That's its supreme value, it seems. And these people in the resistance stand for the human. That's when you have the, transhumanists, coming up, is because they cannot abide by the idea that we might all actually be equal in our worth and
Mhm,
our value. That's anathema.
mhm.
We've never seen that in history, despite their discourses about, humanism and universality. They've never
Of course.
acted as if we
Yes.
were, right?
Yes, exactly, exactly. And then when people from our region insist on it, there's a meltdown that happens. Like, wait, you've been saying this, and I mean, we've known this all along. There's something deeply satisfying actually about seeing what we have known all along come to fruition because they have these meltdowns. Because fundamentally, your universality actually was never universal. Your universal psyche was never universal. We all knew this because we all lived under the boot of your violence, even as vomited out these so-called values. We knew who took the brunt of it, and now that people are rising up and coming together, and like you said, again, to come back to almost the top of our hour, is saying that there's a reconfiguration in the region, in our region, that says enough of this bullshit. Like, this is not going to be how it's done. And there's an end game here. There's an end game, and there's a reconfiguration of what that looks like, and there's a way in which what you're saying is, how do we all join in that process? We might not be on the front lines, but how do we support those who are, if for nothing else, not to allow the propaganda, the sort of the telling of this story or this narrative in only one way, the way we attune to the examples that are happening in front of us. Because that's what you're saying. I mean, somebody had said, if you talked about Arabaeen, we did. So if you go back and rewind, you'll hear what Adnan really movingly laid out for us about Arabaeen, of like, that's in front of us. And like, many people might not know that that's a living, breathing example that just happened
Hmm.
in the world. That's the attunement that I'm thinking about as well. If that there's a responsibility for us to be able to attend to these things and not just sort of get wrapped up in all. Yes, there's the horrors and we need to clock them, but we need to clock also where those horrors are coming from. And I think you're relocating that for us also historically. Adnan, as we wind down, you and I know you're teaching to go back to the great people of Palestine and how much they have to teach us. You're teaching a course in Gaza. Do you want to say a little bit about it? I dropped the link before. I'll drop it again. I'll put it in the show notes as well. But maybe you can give folks a little bit of a sense of that and what your chuffed link is about.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for making space to mention this because, we're all trying to find ways that we can contribute, to this struggle. And one way that I have been delighted to have the opportunity to make some small contribution is teaching this class online for students in Gaza, the Spox for Gaza program that MIT graduate students started using the MIT extension platform to offer courses during the period of the scholasticide, in particular, where none of the Gazan universities
That's
were
right.
able to have classes for students as they were destroyed, devastated. Their faculty and students were being slaughtered. Some of them are actually now able to go back to online courses, but this is the third round, and there's still many students, which is, to my mind, just absolutely amazing that amidst everything, and even when some of their course credit classes through Gazan universities are back online, they are still so committed to
Yes.
advancing their understanding, their knowledge, to having some connection with the world, um, to learn that they have signed up for a variety of courses, one of which is mine, which is called Guerrilla History, the name of a podcast I'm co-host of. Anti-colonial Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History, Theory, Practice, which is a history course really starting mostly with post-World War II resistance movements against empire and against colonialism. of course, they are the ones who can tell us more than anyone about this experience. They have so much to teach us. What I wanted to do was give them some of an understanding of the other world historical movements in which they could see and fit their own experience and what they have been living under in resisting settler colonial genocide. And so I have about 120 students. And what we're doing is we've already raised a lot of money for the program as a whole. There's a specific ask for my class because we want them to do in their own historical research projects and to share the outcomes of their research, whether it's doing an oral history project and interviews with survivors of 1967 or whatever they or survivors or their own experiences during the course of of the genocide, or if they want to do a social biography of a resistance fighter and put that in a kind of context, or if they want to do a community archive project to reverse or preserve against the destruction, the cultural genocide, the historicide that is happening to try and erase people's history in Palestine. If they want to do an archive project, these are all options for them. But also, they might do liberation art, posters, infographics, art installations that represent in a creative way the outcomes of their own historical research. So for supplies and materials and equipment that they might need in their final projects, we're raising some additional money so that they can do creative, interesting projects. And hopefully the idea is that they may do zines, they may do audio, podcasts. We will air like their audio and video podcasts on my channel, and we will find ways to try and share the outcomes of their research so that they can communicate with the rest of the world in a different way about history and about their history and their place in anti-colonial resistance. So if you can support us, you can use the link. We're just trying to raise maybe 2,000-3,000 more to make this happen. People have been generous on my program before to get us to the 20,000 to get them internet access and other things that they needed for the courses to actually take place. But I think this would be a wonderful additional opportunity to make this course very meaningful and to have impact beyond just what they do in the class, but to share it with others and to make them feel that they are guerrilla historians. That's the goal of the class, is to
That's
teach and
amazing.
train.
That's amazing. You're getting a lot of love in the chat. Thank you, folks. If I would just say, whatever you can give, please give, but then send it to a comrade. If everybody here send it to at least one person, post it about it on your social media, whatever the case is, we can help Adnan in making sure that those supplies are available. And I can't wait to see it on your show when it's somebody asked, they're like, can you link it to the students' work? So I'm glad you went ahead and told people that you would be doing that.
We will, and I will also develop a version of the course for general public online in the winter so that people can also be engaged with this history. But I wanted to just first focus on delivering something for the students in Gaza. We'll also have opportunities for other people to learn, but also just to tell people who are, enthusiastic listeners and watchers of Psychic Militancy that your host will also be a guest lecturer for one of the sessions coming up on Psy-War, information war, and psychological resistance and militancy. So, Lara's already contributing greatly from her knowledge and understanding. We'll read from her book. They'll be reading it, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation. And I hope that some of the projects may, really engage with the info war and psychic militancy as well. So if you contribute and help, I'm sure those projects, whatever form they take, we'll share with Lara, and she can share with this community as well.
Absolutely. You know it. The least I can do. A question about my t-shirts, Earth Liberation Studio. I love them. It says decompose the empire. You can't see that part, but it's fantastic. So check out what they have online too. They're comrades who have amazing graphics. That's where that's from. Any last thoughts, Adnan, as we come to
Well,
an end.
I'm just so grateful for the space that you've created for these kinds of discussions, and it was a lot of fun. At a certain point, I had on my list all these other issues, the Yemen
Yes.
situation and the Saudi war and what happened in Sabta and all these things. But at a certain point, I was like, okay, these are just all the usual machinations. We could talk about them. But what I really wanted to kind of communicate is that more hopeful,
Yeah.
maybe inspired by psychic militancy I was feeling myself. Let's
I
focus
love it.
on our own kind of resistant health here.
Yes,
So
absolutely. Yes. Well, this is the place to get that. I'm so happy to have you. شكرا كتير. يعطيك ألف عافية. Folks, thank you so much for joining us and for coming after the short hiatus. There, Jay from Millennials Learning Capitalism will be on a live stream on Tuesday. We're going on a rundown about what the fuck happened in Empire while I was gone. So make sure you check that out. And again, subscribe to Adnan's channel. I'm sure he'll have, between now and Tuesday, he'll probably have like 10 live streams. So make sure you check that out too. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Bye, folks.
Jazakallah. Bye. Salam, everyone.
Salam.